program committee for inviting me to Vancouver. I've been here since yesterday. I've been really excited about the talks that I've attended. And I also want to make a special point of thanking the program staff. They've been wonderful in attending to needs we might have. And I want to thank the computer people in particular because thank you. Could we perhaps turn the lights down on the screen a little bit so it would show up a little bit better? I also want to, right at the onset, thank a few of my colleagues who really, any one of them could be giving this presentation today. The work I'll be presenting is really a collective effort, and I'm just fortunate enough to be here to take the credit today, but it really was a joint effort. William Miller, of course, is a good friend and a colleague. Radka Toskova, clinical psychologist. Gerard Connors really initiated much of the movement of study of spirituality in Project Match. Chad Emmerich, seminal AA researcher. And Richard Longabout, who insists on causal chain modeling, understanding why things work, how they work, rather than just the horse race question of what works. I also want to thank my parents. In spite of evidence to the contrary that it was going to be a difficult haul, they've stayed with me and supported my efforts through the years, and I'm very grateful for having them in my life. There's been over 2,000 years of talk about spirituality. I mean, biblical references to both of it, alcohol as a sacrament, as well as proscriptions about alcohol. So it's always been a yin-yang. There's been this divided nature about alcohol and, by generalization, illicit substances. In New Mexico, for example, they use peyote in the National Indian Church. But there's been a historical relationship between academics and the study of spirituality that has been a little bit difficult. We have this thing called 10-year review, and if you study spirituality, you are putting yourself at risk. And then once one moves to the study of spirituality, you never quite feel like you're swimming in the same herd. You know, it's a little hard to find colleagues who can study that. So when I was asked to come here and talk about spirituality and addictions, I thought, I'm going to be with my own species, you know, and people that would understand me. And to my horror, I don't think you're going to understand this talk, because I'm going to do my best. It's very data-driven. And as I've listened to the presentations, many of you are dealing with issues and questions that we're probably 10 or 15 years away empirically addressing. But I'd like to share with you what we currently empirically know. And so it's very exciting for me. Currently, just to give you some background, there's about 36 NIH-funded projects right now studying spirituality, either as a main or secondary focus relating to addictions. And the mechanisms of research vary considerably. There are what they call K awards, which are individual investigator awards. And then there are larger studies called R01s, which are multi-million-dollar studies of spirituality. To give you some idea of what the empirical field has done in research on AA, which often, by the way, I should say throughout this talk, much of the work has centered on the 12 steps for obvious reasons because of the spirituality and the core, thank you, membership, is that we see that in clinical trials at CASA, about on average 43% of the people will attend AA at some time during or post-treatment. And what's very important to point out is several of these studies that I'm drawing this graph from were pharmacotherapy trials. These were not trials encouraging people to attend AA. So it was a natural, people vote with their feet. What you can also see on this graph here is just the number of published peer-reviewed publications, empirical publications on spirituality in AA. And you can see in the last 5 years, there's been quite an explosion of interest in the area. In general, meta-analytic studies, these are studies that quantitatively combine the results of different studies, have come up with a generalization that on average, we can see about a 0.31 correlation between attendance and later abstinence. And as you might recall, a correlation can range from -1 to 1.0. So if it's on the positive side, it means there's a positive association. And if it's negative, it means don't do it. And what we see 68% of the time then, if we apply the normal curve, is that for people who do attend, we can anticipate relatively little benefit to a modestly positive benefit. Now, and again, I should suggest all this happens in every presentation. If someone says, well, my father or mother has gone to AA, has never drank again, or my mother or father went to AA, didn't work, and they left. So when we deal with the idiographic, There's, of course, exceptions to all that I'm going to say today. All of these analyses are based on nomenclatic or group comparisons. More recently, we've had a number of very important prospective trials. And for those of you who are interested in looking at the published literature in this area, you might look at Project Match, John Morgenstern. There's a VA study by Keith Humphreys and Rudy Moose. And most recently, Project Combine have all looked either directly or indirectly at the association between AA attendance at time 1 and drinking at time 2. And that's very important because if we look at drinking and attendance at the same time, then we have the difficulty of self-selected samples. In other words, those who no longer stay may be drinking and we can't say that AA is beneficial, okay? Or they might be leaving and being abstinent, and we would attribute that benefit to AA when we should not. So it's very important to have temporal ordering to say what is beneficial and what is not. These are very good studies to begin to address some of those questions. I'm going to go very quickly through this. I didn't know the familiarity that people would have with 12-step programs. It was developed in the 30s. Has 2 text core literature, the 12 by 12 and the big book. And really, when one thinks about it, I smile. I'm with Bill Miller. We are kind of the home of manual guided therapy, okay? And we said for years, we can't study AA, we can't study AA. And I retorted at one point that of course we can, it's a manual guided therapy. There's a core literature right there which has very clear hypotheses and very clear prescriptions about what one is to do, right? And then the 12 by 12 is more the practice or the how one should practice the fellowship of AA. Okay. And I won't even have that there for a minute, except the 12 steps. And we can see that researchers typically break them into surrender, action, and maintenance steps, which is also very common in AA meetings. And this is where we start getting into it. Dr. Toskova and I read the core literature, and we developed what we thought were 5 spiritual axioms in AA literature. A belief in a transcendental power, or higher power. Very critically, one has a personal relationship with this higher power. And it's a personal relationship. One unfettered by institutions, church, congregation. Mysticism is central to AA spirituality. The sense of divine intervention, most clearly explained through the gift of sobriety, the gift of abstinence. Faith in a higher power should begin anew each day. If one attends meetings, you hear often the statement, you can't win today's games by yesterday's points. In other words, you must renew your faith each day. And then finally, distress is a signal of one's incongruity with the wishes and the purpose of a higher power. Now, to make a transition, we all know that myths help us understand the world. They may be true and they may be false. And there's a great deal of mythology around AA. I mean, in the popular media, what we see and read in magazines, newspapers, what we hear from people. And I'd like to take just a moment or two to go through a couple myths, and then we'll move forward to spirituality. Myth number 1, all AA meetings are alike. AA is the same wherever you go. 90 meetings in 90 days is often prescribed to people when they're first initiating to AA, and what one hears in AA meetings often is bring the body and the mind will follow. And I'd like to show you what our research shows on that. Very quickly, we sampled 3 AA groups. On average, members had done about 7 to 9 steps. Months of sobriety, 3 to 5 years, so this is a fairly stable group. Average number of meetings, quite a bit, every other day in a typical month. And the percentage of having a sponsor was quite high in 2 groups and low in the other group. So kind of means this is what we would call mainstream AA meetings. They were not specialty meetings at all. And we administered the group environment scale to these. In other words, we asked these members, how do you perceive the functioning of your groups? And what we saw was that there was one group, and I should say, that what is the degree that spirituality is emphasized? What is the degree that orderliness is described? What is the degree that self-disclosure is described? How expressive, cohesive, independent, and aggressive and innovative are your groups? And what we have here are the means plotted for these 3 groups. And you see there's one group that's very expressive and cohesive. And then the others are kind of all over the board. And what we see, of course, is you can't be both cohesive and aggressive. That's basic social group dynamics. But what we see that was interesting is we also asked the groups to what degree are the programs or the prescribed behaviors stressed in your group. And what we see is the high expressive group reported significantly higher endorsement of the prescribed program in meetings. So in other words, highly cohesive, supportive groups also tended to prescribe the active, what we would call as experimenters, the active ingredients of AA, the 12 steps. Okay. So, all meetings are not alike. The practice of AA differs. This is a very simple one graph looking at 90 and 90. As clinicians, we say you go to 90 meetings in 90 days. Okay. This is AA involvement along the x-axis, and along the y-axis is frequency of meeting attendance. And what we find in a treatment-seeking population is that at about 60 days, reports of involvement decline. They plateau. In other words, the advice, if the advice is to get maximal involvement, should be 60 and 90, or about 2/3 of the days. Now, I gave this slide once, and someone afterwards took me to I guess the woodshed is what I'd say. Because, and for good reason, and I always say this after that one incident, this does not speak to the social benefit of a sobriety supportive group. This speaks to the degree to which one is involved in the prescribed behaviors. So 90-90 might have value in other ways other than getting one involved in the prescribed behaviors. What we see, if you can see it on the other side of the far side of that room, is that 3 years, the situation changes though. It reverses. So what we really find, and the next slide will say this, is that, oh, it's not the next slide. Sorry. Bring the body and the mind will follow. I'm going to show you a very complex slide now, and this is where you can start nodding off. Okay. But it's not that bad. It really isn't. What we have is, at 3 points in time, end of treatment, 3 years post-treatment, and 10 years post-treatment, we have measured frequency of meeting attendance and degree that one is involved in AA. And the degree of one is involved in AA is a multidimensional measure. It's saying, do you have a sponsor? Do you read the literature? Do you celebrate AA birthdays, et cetera, et cetera. It's a composite score. And what we see, to no one's surprise, is that at time 1, end of treatment, that predicts later AA attendance. Yesterday's behavior predicts tomorrow's behavior. And again, AA involvement and attendance, end of treatment, are positively related. However, what happens is very interesting. From end of treatment to 3 years, attendance predicts attendance, but involvement does not predict involvement. Okay? Attendance predicts involvement from 1 year to 3 years. Involvement does not predict attendance. On the other hand, what we see at 3 to 10 years is just the reverse. And this is very important to stress. What we see is involvement will predict long-term commitment and attendance. Attendance at 3 years does not predict 10-year involvement whatsoever. So in other words, bring the body and the mind follows is true short-term, but not long-term. Long-term, it's involvement. It's belief system that keeps people in AA. So the myths are neither wholly true or wholly false. You know, they're functional. The program is constant. I have seen very few changes to the core literature in the 15 years I've been looking at AA. In fact, great debates are held about changing things by just 1 or 2 words. The fellowship of the practice is significantly different across groups. Likewise, 90-90 is time-dependent. It's true initially, but not long-term. And mind-body is also time-dependent. Okay? Now, what about drying out spirituality? I love that slide. I'm going to display my ignorance in front of all of you. I have not heard much distinction between treatment versus therapy. Treatment is focused on a targeted behavior, whereas meaning and spirituality and sense of purpose, it tends in my mind to be an issue of therapy. How can a treatment provider in a brief period of time, intensive outpatient, be expected to fully enhance and propel one into a successful life of integrating their inner emotional reality with the outer world to have a sense of purpose that, you know, makes them a citizen in its fullest terms and makes them happy and content? In other words, treatment, I would put forth, can provide abstinence. Long-term therapy would provide sobriety. And I put that purposely in the larger term, not in a 12-step term, although that's where it originally emanates from in their distinction between abstinence and sobriety. And much of the foci of the presentations that I've attended have been issues of therapy and long-term issues. Okay, here's the blueprint for today's talk, and if you remember anything today, this is it right here, okay? We have to be very clear when we're talking about spirituality what perspective we're discussing it. We can talk about spirituality as a dependent measure. How does one's sense of meaning in life and meaning to a higher power or to a God change through the addiction and following addiction and in recovery? How does that change? The independent variable, how could a change in spirituality affect my later substance abuse or enhance my abstinence into what we might term sobriety? Mediating variable, how would spirituality explain or enhance two other variables? And finally, moderating variable, how might one's spirituality influence my receptivity to a spiritual focused treatment? You know, Alan this morning talked about the women's concerns at the prison about, I'm Christian, I'm concerned about that this might conflict with my belief system. So that would be a question of spiritual moderation. And we have to be very clear of what we're talking about. It's very easy to confuse it. Few preliminary comments. What are we measuring with spirituality? Historically, researchers have used three perspectives. Most historically, years and years ago, 50 years ago, reliance on religious affiliation measures. More recently, in the 90s, we started looking at multidimensional measures, distinguishing between religiosity and spirituality, the many dimensions of spirituality, forgiveness, prayer, meditation, daily spiritual practices. And recently, we're beginning to look at the mechanisms. What is forgiveness? What function does forgiveness serve? Is it a coping mechanism? Etc. So there are many psychometrically validated instruments. For those of you who are interested, I can post my presentation. I'll take you through this very quickly. But there's this monster slide I have here. There's at least 15 to 20 psychometrically validated measures with substance abusers that measure different dimensions of spirituality. And I encourage you to access these. Okay? They're, mm-hmm.
Which means the mind does not have any words for it in the moment. So it's a little difficult way to assess for that because you transcended words in the moment.
It's a tough one. What I'm thinking when you ask that question is, how do we measure, for example, humility? How can someone report, I have humility? You know? And we as researchers approach that in many different ways. You might, for example, say, well, let's measure all the things that humility is the opposite of. And if they report high pride, narcissism, what have you, then maybe they're humble. But it's really a tough one when we get into areas, and this is why I distinguish between therapy and treatment. Because within the realm of treatment, we'd say, well, we're not sure we want to go near that one yet. We don't have the measures for that. We don't have a dialectic to approach it. But the therapist does. So it's a tough one. And this somewhat approaches it. What is the underlying structure? I had my fantasy come true about a year ago when we had a sample and we had 7 or 8 measures of spirituality and religiosity. I think collectively there were about 10 scales. And I said, what's going to happen if I put them all together? And then I did something called confirmatory factor analysis, which tells me what is the correlational underlying structure of these responses. And what I found was very surprising. Theoretically, all of these scales should be distinct. Every author said, I have something new to measure about spirituality. And what happened is that did not happen. We have basically 3 domains. One's of practices, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, different things, all grouped together. We then had a factor which I'll call relational, which helped define one's relation to God. And then finally, an affective state. Someone in a presentation yesterday said, meaning has to be felt. And these people would indeed say there is an affective state, which you had just asked a moment ago about, that cannot be voiced. So let's go through these 4 perspectives very quickly and talk about spirituality as a dependent measure. And I do want to put this in the context of Project Match. This was a very large randomized clinical trial, 1,700 people, 11 sites across the United States. And it was very simple. We recruited alcohol. Yeah. They're not yet, but I can if you'd like me to. You can put them out there. You bet. Project Match recruited people presenting for treatment in outpatient sites and recruited inpatient clients seeking aftercare. And they randomized 1,700 clients to one of 3 treatment conditions: cognitive behavioral, motivational enhancement therapy, and 12-step facilitation. They delivered 12 weeks of treatment, and then they followed them for up to 15 months or 1 year. And then the outpatient sample did a 3-year follow-up. And in Albuquerque, we did a 10-year follow-up with that sample. Cognitive behavioral, very research-based. People loved it. The researchers loved it. MET, motivational enhancement, brief therapy, 4 sessions over 12 weeks, and 12-step facilitation. It was not the favorite of the researchers. Community-based treatment, 12 sessions over 12 weeks, modeled after the core literature of AA. Clear spiritual focus, primary objective, facilitate the person into AA, find a sponsor, work through the first 3 steps. These are the changes in spirituality by treatment group. 12 steps, this is the treatment phase right in here. And what we see is an enormous climb in God consciousness, self-reported God consciousness, and then a plateauing post-treatment. But we also saw modest increases in both other groups. In religious practices, this is reading religious scripture, religious attendance, we also saw, to our surprise, a steep increase in the 12-step facilitation, and again, modest increases in MET and CBT. This is over a 3-year period. Another way of looking at this is saying, let's forget about treatment group assignment, and let's just look at who reported AA attendance or not, because many clients assigned to MET and CBT reported AA attendance. Therapists were instructed not to say, you cannot go there. Clients, surprisingly, in MET, which was to mobilize the motivation to accept one's problem and to do something with it, many of the people said, you know what, I think I need to go to AA. So there was quite high participation there. What we see is, in the red line, these are the people over a 10-year period who reported consistent AA attendance over a 10-year interval. And what we see is just a continuous climb in God consciousness. For those who had passed, and passed meaning up to 3 years, but then no longer AA attendance, we see a leveling. And for the no AA group, we see just a kind of a gradual, ever so gradual increase. And I would, by the way, regard that as just maturation over a 10-year period. As we get closer to our maker, we start thinking about a little bit more. As we approach the abyss. Religious practices, likewise, we see, for those who were consistent, a steady increase. And for those other groups, kind of a leveling, initial jump, and then kind of a plateauing. Similar longitudinal trajectories can be reported all day long. You know, I've just listed a couple here that are particularly good ones if you're interested in it. I won't dwell on it too long. And also, one could say, well, these are treatment seeking. What about naturalistic? What about the real world? What about people who are just recruited out of AA? And to date, we're doing a study, and this is about 198 people, 189 people. And what we see is the reporting of the importance of a higher power and practicing of prescribed behaviors. By the way, they're very highly correlated, and this is at the time of study recruitment. And then at 3 months following, we see a very strong relationship. Again, it's very stable, but we see the practicing does not predict importance, but importance predicts practicing, okay? Belief drives behavior. Behavior did not drive belief. This ties into that 60 and 90 statement earlier. What we see is it may be beneficial as a clinician to encourage high rates of attendance, but that will not sustain long-term affiliation.
What about Miller's and I don't know if you were
Hester?
in that book, Quantum Change book?
Yeah.
Because that would go from a linear change to vertical change.
Right.
And sort of change things around, because you can have the intensity of the vertical change in the moment, then in a way it almost is that person like to build up for himself, or is sort of live the program and somewhat cured, but sort of in recovery and has had this huge
Right. Well, you know what? I think Bill called it the Ebenezer Scrooge phenomenon. You know, the boom, I have it. And the type that Bill Wilson described. But also in the core literature it says most of us, however, have the educational variety, more of the William James, more incremental change. So, but we, actually one of my last slides on what do we need to know about is exactly that, the quantum leap. We know very little about it.
Does this slide discredit the fake it till you make it with spirituality? Practicing it doesn't lead to the importance of a higher power.
I hadn't thought of it in that context, but it would support that the practicing of the behaviors without, and how would you guys say it at this conference? Being ingenuine about the practice will not lead to the belief. Yes? Right. And that's the affective of the three dimensions, may be the one that's driving these two. And we have very little on the affective. That's absolutely true. Because that gets into the, you know. This just simply reiterates, generally we have large increases in spirituality as a dependent measure. Narrowly specified dimensions, while present, are not orthogonal. That's a researcher way of saying they overlap considerably. And then spiritual beliefs or meanings seem to drive the practices and not the reverse. Okay, what is the value of spirituality as an independent variable? Okay, and in the core literature, it says very clearly that one will be, how does it go? One will be defenseless against the first drink. One's defense must come from a higher power, which implies, from a scientific perspective, that spirituality is a shield, a coping mechanism, something that will protect one from relapse. What we see at first blush looks kind of supportive of that. Again, this is Project Match, and these are what we call survival curves. And all it shows us is the number of days, end of treatment is right there, and then we go 90, 180, 270 out to the end of treatment. Can you see that? Is that a little bit better? Okay, you bet. And what we see is, as all of you as clinicians know, this immediate drop-off, really fast relapse immediately after treatment, and then a plateauing. And what we see are the clients assigned to TSF have a significantly slower relapse, time to relapse relative to the other two treatment conditions. Now, as Alan's written about and is empirically validated, time to first drink might be slower in the TSF condition, but when drinking occurs, there's an abstinence violation effect, and drinking is more heavy. So that's the other part of the coin to say, because they've been told in AA, you'll have a loss of control, and certainly when they drink, they have a loss of control. Okay? Because again, belief drives behavior. So one might think that a spiritual-based treatment is, spirituality is the independent variable, right? But what we see, and this is controversial, but I think it really has to be said at this meeting, prospective studies, studies that measure spirituality at time 1 and behavior at time 2, which is basic causal ordering that we have to have in our research. When we look at spirituality or religious affiliation, number of studies was about, I believe, 17 studies that I got through the literature. We have a relationship of 0.09. That is virtually zero. Okay? No relationship between spirituality and later drinking or abstinence. Okay? As an independent variable. This just gives you a little bit more of the nitty-gritty. These are more of those correlations that can range from -1 to 1. And what we see is modest positive correlations between spiritual, religious practices, spiritual meaning. This is Pargament's measure of purpose in life. And we see really very modest relationships. And ultimately, these have asterisks, which means in the scientific world, probability less than 1 in 20 is significant. But I ask you, would you triage, would you recommend to a family member a spiritual experience for later abstinence based on the magnitude of these relationships? I don't think I would. I don't think I would. You know, it says there's a slight positive association between abstinence There's a slight negative association between drinks per drinking day, days to first drink, days to first heavy drinking day. But these are very modest, very modest. Nope, but I'll tell you what I'm going to attribute to in a minute. We have modestly better prediction in Project Match. You know, those were like 0.1, 0.15 relative to the 0.00. But as I asked, would you really clinically tell a client, we're going to work on a spiritual experience? You know, we're going to work on a spiritual experience to keep you sober, to keep you abstinent. And again, this is that longitudinal study I talked about. So we're here now, we're saying, but is that only true of a treatment-seeking sample? And what we see, again, are slightly stronger correlations, but still very modest. Very modest between belief in a higher power, the importance of a higher power for recovery, and prescribed behaviors. That's step work, reading core literature. Modest. Now, there's a concept in research where if we have enough subjects, we could declare this significant, a statistical power. But I'm addressing this from the issue of the magnitude of the effect, the importance of the effect. And again, this is the SCQ, Pargamit's spiritual coping questionnaire. And here he has a construct of one has a deferring relationship with a higher power. I do what God leads me to do. I follow God's will. You know, the third step prayer, thy will, not mine, be done. Spiritual coping can also have a cooperative style. When I'm confronted with a problem, I seek God's counsel, I move forward. Okay. Again, what we see in this naturalistic sample is really very modest relationships between spiritual measures at time one and the drinking measures. Now, in preparation for today's talk, I thought, I know someone's going to bring this up, so I'm going to do it. The green line is, it's not where one is at to predict where I'm at tomorrow. It's the gain, it's my movement in spirituality that's important, not really a static measure of spirituality. And when I looked at the gain change scores at times 1 and 2 and predict 0.3, now I'm suddenly getting correlations. I'm saying, I begin to see some importance here. So it's not really where I'm at, it's more my trajectory in my spiritual movement that may be important in predicting. This is a totally new area. I don't know if anyone else is really looking at that one right now. Maybe Libya's. Does spiritual or religiosity predict other positive outcomes? Now we're getting into the therapy issue of, okay, aside from the target behavior, what do we know about spirituality? And Leanne Cascudas has what's called a helping activities checklist, and she looks at behaviors that are community activity behaviors, volunteer community behaviors, general activities, family, I pick up my children, I help drop them off, I help around the house, and then kind of recovery activities, and this is 12-step focused. And what we see, this is confirmatory factor analysis with measurement models. I know, stop talking that way. It's what we see is at time 1, we have total religiosity. And it significantly, at 10 years, predicted helping behaviors. So one's religious beliefs and practices were significantly predictive to the extent that one was involved in community activities, general living activities, and recovery activities. This is a big correlation. This is something that we can say, if one wanted a client to become engaged as a citizen, spiritual change has value. Spirituality as a mediator. Is the positive relationship between AA attendance and later drinking reduction mediated by spirituality? Now what time am I done? 2:50? 15. This is a difficult one to understand. We know there's a positive relationship here. But what we want to know is, and there's a positive relationship here. When we look at it as a dependent measure, that's a positive relationship. But what we don't know is if we put this in, does this relationship go away? In other words, spirituality explains it. It's a question of mediation. So I'm going to take you through, in 2 minutes, you all are going to learn structural equation modeling. I know. We had at baseline these measures of client functioning. And I think most clinicians would regard these as important dimensions in treating a substance abuse problem. The AUI-G scale, that is the general involvement that someone has with alcohol. the ASI psychiatric severity measure, the audit alcohol dependence measure, motivation, readiness for change, Eureka, Socrates. These are common dimensions that clinicians would be interested in when someone says, I think I have a drinking problem. And what we find is we can model this as a latent construct which says problem severity, okay? So we have, at step 1, a client with high problems. At time 2, what does this client do 9 months later? There's a positive relationship between that problem severity and being committed to the 12 steps of AA, the program. And this is measured multidimensionally. It includes the degree that they report step work, the degree that they practice prescribed behaviors, the frequency of AA meeting attendance, their God belief. Okay, all these correlations are positive. So this we discussed earlier with the meta-analysis where we said there's a 0.31 correlation. Well, whoa, 0.30, a different sample. It's amazingly robust. Now, we add a little bit more to it. We're saying AA commitment predicts abstinence at months 10 through 15. Again, not a big surprise. Notice, though, when we put commitment in there, this is 0, virtually 0. My problem severity does not predict the degree that I will be abstinent 10 to 15 months later, okay, in this particular model. Now, let's make it more complicated. Who will attend and who will not? What we see is, to no one's surprise, my wife is a clinician, Radka Skova, and she said, well, that's the biggest no-brainer up here. Those who are high and severe do not have social networks that support continued drinking. But if they do, there's a negative relationship between that person going to AA. In other words, for those people who are highly dependent, who do have networks supportive of continued drinking, they will not go to AA. This is the big one right here. AA commitment predicts abstinence. AA commitment predicts increased God belief. But there's the story right there. God belief did not predict % abstinence. In other words, one's God belief did not mediate this relationship or this relationship. So we ask ourselves, why? What is the problem? We had to go back to the drawing board. My take on reading the core literature is that it is fundamentally a very eclectic, pragmatic program. Even the development of the term the big book is fundamentally pragmatic. Does everyone in here know why the core literature of the big book is called the big book? No. Okay. Very quick sidebar issue. When they first wrote the first edition, there was a great deal of controversy back and forth about should they charge or should they give it out free. And of course, it was decided eventually that they had to sell it just so that they could keep publishing it. But Bill Wilson decided that he wanted to have it printed on very coarse paper, intentionally, very cheap paper, so that the alcoholic thought they were getting a big book, more for their money. That's why it's called the big book. And so, true, they knew exactly what to pander to on that.
And you're looking at these measures
Yes.
of the concept of God. It could be a conceptual experience that you're describing for people as opposed to the emotional effect. Are there any studies that show the level of emotional connection that someone feels as opposed to a belief in importance?
Yes, there are. I'm not reporting on them today, but there are ones that we'll look at that they're always hampered by what was actually asked earlier about how can one verbalize an affective response. So you always have that problem that you're asking someone to verbalize something that they're feeling. But yes, you can ask them, do you feel you've had a change of heart? We are conducting a study now where we're asking the significant other of the substance abuser, what differences do you see in this person's behavior and emotion? And that helps us triangulate a little bit more. So, we had a hypothesis that we developed, and I'm very excited because it was supported, and it kind of makes sense too. What we predicted was spirituality might be a secondary or an indirect mediator. And because of time, I'm going to get really down to it really fast. What we found is this is what we've been talking about thus far. AA at 3 years would predict AA at 10 years, and it does, somewhat. AA at 3 years does not predict 10-year abstinence. Current AA attendance predicts abstinence. That's not too controversial. This model below, though, is controversial. Same model, except now we have spirituality mediating the relationship between AA practices at 3 and 10 years. And what we see is, notice here, AA practices at 3 and 10 years were strongly related. But when we have spirituality in there, it does not, AA practices at 3 years does not predict 10 years. In other words, it's a belief drive again, where AA practices predict spirituality, spirituality predicts sustained AA attendance, but AA attendance and practices does not predict sustained AA attendance, okay? So this is a very critical point where what we see is, for lack of better terms, spirituality might be seen as a shared ideology that holds members to the fellowship of AA. If we can talk about it that way. It's a coping strategy that helps people remain affiliated with one another. And by the way, we see AA practices predicts at 10 years significantly long-term abstinence. Notice, by the way, again, spirituality does not predict abstinence directly. What we see, and what is, I don't think, very controversial, is that spiritual and religious beliefs promote social networks that are supportive of abstinence. One has a sense of community. One has a sense of attachment. The spirituality will lead one to stay affiliated with others. Now, I've spoken with many AA members about these findings, and they would say, some have said, in practicing my spirituality, I continue to help others. In necessarily helping others means that I stay affiliated with AA. Okay. That would be their description of this finding. But we also know from the finding earlier with Leanne Kaskoudas that spirituality also helps predict community behaviors, and general living behaviors. So what one could argue is that the function of spirituality, it's like the myths that I first went through. They're not true or false. Spirituality seems to sustain right living, which in turn predicts positive outcome. But spirituality in and of itself does not seem to predict positive outcome. Spirituality is a moderating variable. This one can be very quickly gone through. Really, does pre-treatment spirituality influence the degree of acceptability of spiritual treatment? And does spirituality moderate one's willingness to affiliate with a 12-step program? Okay, this is such an important topic that an entire chapter is dedicated in the core literature to this, and the chapter is called We Agnostics. What we see, I'll just take you very quickly through it, in 12-step facilitation, which is primarily a spiritual-focused treatment, we see that atheists had the lowest attendance in Project Match when assigned to TSF. Okay, we have atheists, agnostics, unsurers, and I've never figured out the difference between agnostics and unsurers, but we gave them that response category. They were unsure if they were agnostic, I guess. Then we had the spiritual and we had the religious. And we can see there's a slight difference there, but not a tremendous difference. But clearly the atheists who were assigned to the 12-step facilitation attended therapy less frequently. When we look at why that might have been the case, this is a measure simply, here we have our little groups here again, atheist, agnostic, unsure, spiritual, religious. But each of these little bars represent a mean score, and we're talking like 400 people contributing to each mean, of their therapeutic bond, the degree that they liked their therapist, the degree that they felt bonded to their therapist, the degree that they were in agreement about the tasks of therapy, the degree that they were in agreement with the goal of therapy. And again, you see the atheists and the agnostics were clearly the lowest when assigned to 12-step facilitation. Okay. So they attended less and they were less enthusiastic about their therapist. I always shudder when I have to show this because it takes 10 minutes to describe it. But again, we have our atheists, agnostics, unsure, spirituals, and religious. This group, the dark hatched area, shows the proportion of those individuals that attended no AA whatsoever. And this was in a treatment, a therapy, encouraging them strongly, monitoring their AA attendance. And what we see is over half, 65% of the atheists, which is admittedly a rather small group, never attended any AA. versus those who are religious and spiritual were the lowest. You can just see a very easy, gradual decline in non-attendance. Or, put more positively, on this side, the proportion who attended consistently. So, pre-treatment spiritual beliefs were a very strong moderator to the acceptability of treatment, as well as the willingness to get involved in the 12-step facilitation. This is simply, and here comes the twist, there's always a twist. This is the relationship between one's spiritual beliefs and AA attendance and 2 drinking measures. And what we see is there's no difference. If you get an atheist to attend, they derive equal benefit. They're less likely to attend, but if they attend, they report equal benefit as a spiritual and religious person. The flip side of that is being religious and spiritual gives you no advantage either. Everybody reported relatively equal benefit in percent days abstinent and drinks per drinking day. I won't bore you. This is the weighted correlation. That's the average relationship. And this is a fancy statistic that asks me, are those correlations different? And they're not. So, atheists and agnostics significantly less likely to attend and sustain AA attendance. There's no difference between religious and spirituals in attendance and sustaining. And for those who do attend, atheism is not a disadvantage, nor is religiosity an advantage in deriving benefit. So it's not straightforward. What do I want to know about? Okay, integration. The first question today was exactly, I think, first on my list. Actually, it was the second. Ebenezer Scrooge. Okay. What about that quantum leap? What about that sudden hitting bottom? What about that recognition of all is wrong? And as I have a colleague talk to me about, what about that moment of clarity when everything is falling apart and everything is put together at the same moment? You know, we know absolutely nothing about that from an empirical perspective. Okay? I think you have to teach us about that. I really do. See, we as researchers have to learn more about that. Okay? I found that in going through the core literature, these hypotheses are the promises of AA. Those are predictions. Those are hypotheses. If you do these things, such and such will happen. Drop in anxiety. Those are testable things. What is the role of anything of spirituality in distinguishing between abstinence and sobriety? We don't know. We know that spirituality leads to greater involvement in the community. We know that it leads to more involvement in the family. We know that it leads to a number of these behaviors. But is that sobriety? We did something very interesting. We have, in Albuquerque, a very good relationship with the AA community. I have to say this. We have some very prescribed behaviors of how we approach them for research, and it's a mutually respectful relationship. And after we do our studies with them, we always go back at their group conscience and pull out our PowerPoint and show them that. And they always go, yeah, we knew that. Yeah. But it's a respect. They've given their time and effort, so we provide that to them. And we did a very interesting study where we got a group, and we said, everyone write down in this group those people who have sobriety versus abstinence. We're not going to share this with anybody else. So we got them all the lists together, and we found out, okay, we matched, okay, here, Steve is mentioned on 4 or 5 lists. This person has sobriety. And at the same time, we measured all of them on measures of depression, adjustment, well-being. And what we found is, while there was a clear group identified as sober versus abstinent, the measures were all the same. No one had, these people, the relationship between group membership as abstinent or sober was not related to scores on depression, well-being. So there's something there. It's very elusive, and I don't know what it is. Again, you need to teach us about it. Okay. Really, one of the most curious areas for me is, what does spirituality mediate other change agents? Okay, this is a really interesting area, like social networks and interpersonal level, like today's talk. How does spirituality mobilize other fundamental change agents in our life that are not target behavior, that are not addiction behavior, but are behaviors and cognitions and affective responses that are critical for our functioning? We know very little about that as well. So, I am all talked out. Just pass that and say, thank you. You were very patient with the data presentation.